Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So, today we have received new information about Russian missile use within the confines of this conflict. And a lot of mainstream media reporting had indicated that Russia would be running out of various weapon systems, missile systems, to include the Kh-101, the Kalibr, the Iskander missile systems that the Russians have frequently used in this conflict. We have an exact rundown on the missile systems that the Russians have fired into Ukraine thus far. So in regards to the Iskander M and the Iskander K, so the Russians have fired 758 Iskander M's at Ukrainian targets. They have fired 79 Iskander K systems. In regards to the Kalibr, again, these are the sea-launched systems fired from Russian warships and Russian submarines. A total of 689 Kalibr missiles have been striking Ukrainian targets since the start of the conflict. In regards to the Kh-101, these are a Tomahawk-like cruise missile that is launched from a Russian bomber. These could be launched from Bear bombers and other Russian aircraft. A total of 876 Kh-101s have been launched against targets inside of Ukraine. The Kh-22, Kh-32, 236 have been launched. The Kinzhal or the Dagger Kh-47, a total of 25 of those systems have been launched against Ukrainian targets. And then finally, the Onyx. The Onyx, very high-speed cruise missile. A total of 145 of those have targeted Ukrainian forces. So quite a lot of missiles have been fired by Russian forces at Ukrainian targets. Now, back in 2022, the total production of all of these systems, to include Iskander, Kalibr, Kh-101s, were about 500 missiles. The Russians produced about 500 of those systems. Now remember, we were hearing in the mainstream media that the Russians were running out of these systems. The Russians could not build these systems anymore. Now, as of today, it is projected by the Pentagon here in the United States, and other analysts as well, believe that the Russians are going to produce over 1,000 of these systems. So they're going to double production this year. So last year, 2022, they manufactured 512. This year, they are going to produce over 1,000 of those systems. Now, the remaining systems, the systems that they have stockpiled and not yet used, are classified. We don't know the actual numbers that the Russians possess. There are some ideas in terms of how many the Russians have remaining in stock, but again, the Russians are continuing to produce these systems en masse, and in all likelihood, based on the way military production occurs, the Russians will probably then double those 1,000 missile systems. So in 2024, I would say it's not outside the realm of possibility that the Russians will manufacture over 2,000 of these missile systems. And again, just because the Russians are under sanctions does not mean the Russians cannot manufacture many of these systems. And then compounding that, the Russians have the capability of getting these systems from China and some other friendly nation states as well. So it's not like the door is completely shut on the Russians importing these systems. It's a false narrative. Simply not true. Now, in the ongoing conflict, in the ongoing war, there has been a new breakthrough by Russian forces. It is not being talked about on this site. This is a Ukrainian-supported site in terms of the mapping system. Generally, they will update the map, but they have not done so as of yet. Specifically, where the Russians have broken out is, again, in the area that I talked about before, north of Seversk. Watch this area very closely. If you look at this area here, we are receiving reports that the Russians have broken through Ukrainian lines and have made it all the way to this reservoir. However, it is not being updated on this map. If we look at the range is about 3 kilometers to that area. So again, very interesting to see what is happening on the ground. We are also hearing about another Russian counteroffensive taking place in the south, running from Zaporizhia towards Volhodar. Remember, this is where the Ukrainians were very much focused on their counteroffensive. Remember, we were talking at the start of June about the Ukrainians breaking through Russian lines, and their goal was the seizure of Tokmak, Melitopol, Berdyansk, and ultimately Mariupol. That was the Ukrainian prime objective. Didn't happen. Did not occur. Now we're starting to see the Russians starting to launch limited counterattacks in this area as well. Again, not being updated on the map. At some point, I believe this website will have to update the map in order to remain legitimate in terms of its coverage on the conflict. But again, heavy fighting continues, whereas the Russians were on the defensive. We are now seeing the Russians starting to launch counter operations against the Ukrainians. And we are still seeing the Russians using lots of artillery, lots of long-range rocket systems. We have seen in recent days a number of thermobaric missile strikes by Russian forces against Ukrainian troops that were accumulating near the front lines. The Russians have, just like the Ukrainians, very good intel on the movements of opposing forces. So whereas the Ukrainians are receiving up-to-date satellite information from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, specifically the United States, the Russians have drones and assets themselves. And as the Ukrainians prepare for operations, they start to mass and accumulate forces. We have seen the Russians hit those forces over the last several days, at times, again, using very large thermobaric munitions against Ukrainian forces. We think right now the artillery situation for the Ukrainians has become dire. A lot of Ukrainian depots have been struck and destroyed by the aforementioned long-range missile systems that the Russians have been using. And again, the Ukrainians are using a lot less artillery systems, firing a lot less artillery than what we've seen in the past several weeks and several months. And again, as we've talked about before, the reason the United States is switching to sending these cluster munitions is because the United States' own stockpile of 155 millimeter munitions is starting to run low in this conflict. The United States has already supplied over 2 million 155 millimeter rounds and other artillery systems to the Ukrainians. Massive amounts, massive inflows of weapon systems as this war continues. But that's where we are sitting for today. We are continuing to watch the situation north of Seversk in this area as Russia continues offensive operations, their own offensive operations against Ukrainian forces. We're also watching very closely what is happening along the southern Zaporizhzhia front as well. So stay tuned. More to come very, very soon. Thank you for joining us today. And as always, have a good day.